Okay. Whew, that was loud. It's good to see everyone this evening. I'm glad you're here. I hope you're having a good week. We actually got a little bit of rain here at the building. We went outside and made some sacrifices and stuff like that. We didn't know what to think with a little bit of rain on us, but I hope you are having a good week this week. A reminder, please be here next week for a wonderful lesson that will be given by Lance Williams. He will be your teacher next week. I will not be here. I will miss you terribly. I will weep, cry, and gnash my teeth on not seeing you, but I will miss you. So the homework that I give tonight is not for next week. It will be for when we return. I think October 1st maybe is the next Wednesday night after that one, but I very much think you will appreciate and enjoy Lance's lesson. He always does a good job when he teaches, and he'll be very well prepared. And so anyway, tonight we are going to come up to one of those, another monumental time in the history of the people of Israel. We have talked about some monumental times in here. The construction of the first temple in Jerusalem, underneath Solomon's reign. So very important time period, the culmination perhaps of the Israelites going into the promised land and establishing a permanent, we'll say permanent tongue-in-cheek, a permanent place to worship Yahweh and for Him to dwell and interact with His people. But now we come up on an event and a time where Solomon really messes up. And it has long-term consequences. And it has long-term consequences in the fact that from this point in the story of the history of Israel until really the end of Israel in ancient history, and it falling under the rule of foreign powers for really about over 1,000 years, nearly 2,000 years, we see that it's divided. We see it's divided into two nations, and we'll talk about those. We obviously won't talk about the end of Israel and Judah or the end of Israel at all in this book, but we will see the repercussions of that. And they're not always friendly with each other. They will war amongst each other, and it just really seems like they become two nations. And this ripping apart, we'll see, is due to the prophetic word that Jeroboam encounters. We will finish most of the way through 12. Now, we won't talk about Jeroboam and that golden calf until the following week or the following lesson, because it kind of goes with the rest of the stuff we'll learn about Jeroboam in 13 and 14 when we read that. But this is really a sad and terrible thing, but it is told that God is going to do that. He's going to divide the kingdom because of Solomon. And Solomon has made a terrible mistake, and he makes a terrible mistake. We'll talk about what that is if you read your stuff going in. We know that the Lord commanded His people when they went into the promised land that they will not make any covenants with the inhabitants of the land. For when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to their gods, someone will among you some of them among them will invite you, and you will eat of the sacrifice. And you will take wives from among their daughters for your sons, and their daughters who prostitute themselves to their gods will make your sons also prostitute themselves to their gods. Now, this is a little bit of an out of context reference, because we do not see that Solomon marries into and with Canaanite women. Solomon marries women from the nations that surround Israel. And probably with good political savvy, he does this. We already see that he married a princess from Egypt, and that created a bond, probably trade flowing between Egypt and Israel. But he marries from these people around him, including the daughter of Pharaoh. He marries women from the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonian, and the Hittite women. Those are not Canaanite people. Now, they are people who live outside of that and on countries around that area. And so many of them, and they're noble women, we're told in the text, or some of your translations may call it a princess. And so many of these were probably political marriages. And when we look and see the deities that Solomon created altars to and high places to and all that, it's the gods of these different people. But the gist of the story is correct because gist of what God says here is applicable because Solomon, the text tells us, was led astray to other gods because he married these women. And when we talk about that, it seems, why in the world would he have done that? This guy was so rock solid, and he was given divine wisdom by God himself, but he is very unwise. In the men's class, this past Monday morning, we had a really good conversation. We were studying about Gideon that morning, but we had studied through several of the kings of Israel, including Solomon and Josiah, that I'm going to mention later on. And the question came up, and it was well asked by one of the men that morning, why was it so easy for Israel and Solomon and others just to go away to these gods? It just seems like all that's got to happen is the wind blow a different direction, and they chase after these gods. And so we talked for several minutes about why that may happen and why that's very strange to us. Now, first of all, it's very strange to us because we don't believe any other gods exist. Would I be correct in saying that? No, I'm talking about actually exist. I'm not talking about that they exist in literature or in the mythos of a society. We really don't believe there are any other gods, right? We don't believe in Milcom or Chemosh or any of these people. We don't think they exist at all. And it's strange for us to do that. Then really, a lot of other people out in our world, they don't believe any gods exist. And so it's one of those things where you really leave the church too far and stray out into too much of society. They may not believe in any deities whatsoever. Now, when I say gods, I mean someone in charge. We certainly believe in other divine beings, right? Other supernatural beings. We believe in angels. We believe in Satan. We believe in demons, whatever that is. I'm talking about like somebody that's in charge, a deity of that nature. Keep in mind that I don't think for 1 minute that Solomon or most of the people in Israel ever thought there were no other gods. And if we think about when we read in Scripture, they don't ever seem to act like they don't believe that there's any other gods. It would be very normal for everyone around them in the entire milieu that they are submersed in their environment of all the ancient Near East, that everybody else believed in gods. It's even not impossible that they believed in Yahweh. And so that's fine. Israelites got a God just like we got a God. We also talked about maybe them hedging their bets. For example, when Yahweh didn't send rain, perhaps Baal can, or Milcom can, or Chemosh, or any of these other gods that may be mentioned. We'll pray to those gods too. Maybe they'll send rain. I don't know that Israel ever abandoned, I don't even think Solomon abandoned the worship of Yahweh, but I think he just started this syncretistic way of trying to mix the religion together. And so we ultimately talked about it would have been very normal for everybody that surrounded Israel to believe in multiple gods. And because of the influence of people who believe in multiple gods, I don't know that his Sidonian wife would have any problem with the fact that Yahweh existed. And fine, Solomon, if you want to worship Yahweh, that's fine, but we're also going to worship these gods. We're going to worship the gods of the Hittites or anybody else. It's so absurd to us that we can't figure out why. But obviously it was not that hard. Because even if we look back as we were that morning in the time of the judges, Gideon helped them out for 40 years. Remember, Gideon started out by tearing down an altar to Baal and Asherah that his father built. And Gideon's name is Jerubbaal. His name means let Baal establish. And so we're talking about even a man that wound up being a judge of Israel was brought up in a pagan environment. And his townspeople were all upset that somebody tore down the Asherah pole and the altar to Baal. So Israel was all the time going astray. And so it's disappointing and it's sad. It's even more tragic with Solomon because we've had all this grandeur, this magnificent temple, all this gold, all this income, foreign dignities bowing at his feet, impressed by his mightiness, and he had a lot of wives. You got to have a lot of political connections when you got 700 wives. That's a lot. And 300 concubines. We'll talk about the difference between a wife and a concubine when we talk here in just a minute, because there is a difference between those in status. But we just think about the glory of Solomon and how tragic it is that someone with this great wisdom squanders it and people suffer because of it and a nation is divided. It's the same thing that happens today when a church lacks wisdom, or we lack wisdom in our lives and we don't seek it and we don't try to find it. Typically disaster follows. And so we see an indictment of Solomon handed down in the first 13 verses, and we see God give this formula again: because you did not follow in the footsteps of my son David, you did not, put away all these other gods. And we're going to see that what Solomon establishes here and what Jeroboam established, they exist all the way to the time of Josiah, centuries later. I mean, the corruption does not go away. It stays and gets worse and worse as you go through. So wives and concubines, what is the difference? Some of the differences may be that they have a different social status. They may have a different rank. Some marriages may be politically strategic. He may have married multiple women from different nations, or keep in mind there may be different factions in some of these foreign nations that he marries amongst them and these foreign women. And the status of their children may be very different. I hear people misspeak often and say Solomon's sons, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Jeroboam was not a son of Solomon. Rehoboam was, and a pretty old son of Solomon by the time he takes the throne at the age of 41, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But can you imagine the mayhem of that? And having that many wives and housing and feeding that many women and the children that are produced from that. The Lord tells his people in Deuteronomy, the king, when y'all have a king, shall not multiply for himself many wives. And there's a reason for that. Now, and his father David was guilty of that as well. David had many, many wives and concubines. Really, as far as I know, Saul may have been the one who only had just like one wife, but he probably had other concubines as well. And so just a different status to what that means there. But 1,000 total women that we see involved in that. And if these women weren't godly, Yahweh-fearing women, I can see where he would get involved with their gods in doing that. The other thing is, Solomon was not young. He was old. It says in verse 4, it tells us, when he was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. His heart was not true to Yahweh his God, as was the heart of his father David. And we see this long list of all these different gods. Ashtoreth, or Ashtoreth, however you pronounce that, Milcom, Chemosh, Molech. Molech was a god that involved, worship of him involved child sacrifice. And so when we think about some of these terrible things that are going on, if you see way over in the time of Josiah in 2 Kings 23, he is tearing down the altars that were built to these gods and the terrible things that were going on around these gods. They persevere for a long, long time. Because when we think about King Josiah, he reigned in like the 7th century, so probably 300 years after the time of Solomon, or 250 years after the time of Solomon. These things persisted, and when Jesus refers to Gehenna, the trash dump outside of Jerusalem, that valley of Hinnom is where they used to have child sacrifice, and a terrible, disgusting place that Jesus uses euphemistically, if you will, for a place of eternal torment. And hell. And so terrible abominations that they go to, chasing after all these foreign gods. He builds a high place for them. He does the same for all his foreign wives. He offers incense and he sacrificed to their gods. And the Lord was upset. The Lord was very, very angry. Can you imagine the sense of betrayal that Yahweh feels? After all I've given you, wisdom and riches and power and respect by foreign powers, and this is how you repay me. This is how you act back towards me in this glorious kingdom that you have. He turned his heart away. And it's interesting at the end of verse 9, he says, and Yahweh, who had appeared to Solomon twice. It's not as if Yahweh was far off. He had spoken with Solomon directly twice. How many people can say that, in the Bible, that has happened with them? And so he just indicts them that he's turned away. And there's going to be consequences for this. And we'll talk in just a minute about this prophet that Jeroboam encounters. out on the road, and what he says, but he said, I'm going to tear the kingdom away, but because of David, I'm not going to take it all away. I'm going to leave one tribe behind. And so now often you may look at a map or think about things with Israel, and you say, well, wait a minute, there seems to be in the southern kingdom of Judah seems to encompass the tribal lands of both Judah and Benjamin within those boundaries. Now keep in mind that when we talk about 12 tribes of Israel, there's really only 11 total tribes that get land. Because which tribe did not get any land allocated to it? Levites don't get it, because they're spread throughout the kingdom, taking care of priestly duties. Now, however, there is a tribe that was divided in two. Do you remember who the father was of the tribe that gets divided in two? Ephraim and Manasseh, right? The sons of Joseph, who have a double portion inheritance in the land. And so really there's like 13 groups of peoples, but only 12 of them have lands. But here the Lord says you're going to be able to keep the tribe of Judah. That one tribe will remain in, and that's the name that winds up taking for that. Now look, I don't think that people were necessarily still within their tribal boundaries completely. There may have been people from all kinds of different tribes living around Israel, but I think they stayed pretty close to their ancestral land. We'll see them talk about, like, for example, in the story of King Ahab, when he wants to buy this land from this vineyard, and the guy says, no, I don't. This is my ancestral land. And so they didn't move off of it that much, but I'm sure some people may have moved around a little bit. But one tribe is going to go to Solomon's son, Rehoboam, but the bulk of them will become a whole other kingdom, and as we'll see, under the rule of Jeroboam. What else does the Lord do? Because he told him, if you'll follow my ways, I'll bless you. Also keep your enemies at bay. And Solomon enjoyed victory over his enemies, didn't he? He enjoyed that ability to keep his enemies away. So what does the Lord do? He raises up adversaries against Solomon. They come from both directions. Hadad is someone we see his name means thunder. He is an Edomite prince. We see the background of his story over in 2 Samuel chapter 8. Way back before Solomon's time, he goes and seeks refuge and finds land and also marriage in Egypt, and he is biding his time, and this opportunity comes back. Now, he says he wants to come back, and Pharaoh kind of maybe to him a little bit in a threatening says, oh, have you not enjoyed everything under my rule? Why don't you stick around? But when we see where this comes from, I know this map is hard to make out in detail. I don't mean for you to be able to read the cities. What I want you to see is Hadad was coming from the southern part, from the area of the Sinai Peninsula, coming into the southern part of Israel. And then this next person, Rezon, which name means prince. I don't know if it's his proper name or his title. He is a Syrian and Aramean leader of ancient Near Eastern pirates. This band of marauders around the ancient city of Damascus. We are introduced to him also in 2 Samuel chapter 8. During the time of David, these people have been stewing for a long time. He is coming from the area of what we even call modern-day Syria to the north and slightly to the east of Israel. So both sides. He is raising up enemies from both sides, closing in on Solomon, and also an enemy within. When we have Jeroboam, an Ephraimite, who is a former labor supervisor under Solomon. We see that talked about in chapter 11 in verse 26. Why did he rebel against King Solomon? Well, he used to work for Solomon, organizing labor. It says in 28, he's very able, and he was industrious and gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. But when Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahiah the Shilonite found him on the road, and Ahiah had on brand new clothes. And he took those clothes, and when he ran into Jeroboam, he took hold of the garment, and he tore it into 12 pieces. And he took hold of the new garment, and he said, take for yourself to Jeroboam, and thus says the Lord God of Israel, take 10 pieces. See, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes. One tribe will remain his for the sake of my servant David, and the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. And then he gives the reason again. And if it seems like it's repeated several times, this is why I'm doing this to Solomon. This is why I'm doing it to Solomon. Because I believe the writer want to nail home this point. You know, often when we see things repeated in the biblical text, both in the time of the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, it really is wanting you to get the point. Often, for example, and this is not an exact parallel, but do you remember when Jesus is saying something to his disciples and he really, really wants them to listen? He says to them, "Amen, amen, lego humen." Truly, truly, I say to you. That means pay attention. That's like when your parents used to call you by like your full name. That meant to pay attention right now. When he says that, we sometimes, I can say it in the King James. Verily, verily, I say unto you. Doesn't it sound better when I say verily, verily, I say to you? But he said, I want you to listen. And we see oftentimes things repeated. Think about how many times we see the conversion story of Paul. We see one about, when it actually happens early on in Acts, and then we see him repeat it twice later on to rulers. Things that are written more than once, especially in the Old Testament, are just driving home the point. Because we just found out, okay, we know that it's because he chased after these foreign gods, and God enumerates them again in going through that. Now, it's interesting. I don't know what Ahiah did with the extra piece of clothing. Maybe he covered up himself with that. Because remember, he tore it in how many pieces? This open book test. 12 pieces, and he gave Jeroboam 10, and he said, I'm going to leave one for, what's that? For the house of David. And so, you guys that are good at math in here, we're missing one. He doesn't have one. Maybe Ahiah needed one piece of clothing to cover up himself and going back. But that's what I mean by saying things are very symbolic in this sense, because he doesn't divvy out all pieces in looking through that. Maybe he holds back what stood for Levi. I don't really know exactly why that is. Jeroboam rebels against him. Well, Solomon sought after and tried to kill Jeroboam, and he fled to where? Where does everybody go when they're trying to get away from somebody in Israel? Well, let's go to Egypt and go down into Egypt. Now that's interesting, because we have King Shishak of Egypt and remained there until the death of Solomon. It tells you how fickle perhaps the relationship between Egypt and Solomon was, right? Because Hadad has come back up out of Egypt and attacked Solomon, and Pharaoh doesn't stop that. Pharaoh's willing to give refuge to a traitor, a rebel against Solomon. Perhaps the king of Egypt senses the tide changing and he's being a little bit more strategic. Politically, the Egyptians have been politicians much longer than Israel had been politicians. Perhaps he sensed, I hear they're getting attacked on their north side by Syrian raiders. Hadad is attacking him. I may just sit back and pick who I'm going to back and be friends with. So when we think about this whole story of Jeroboam coming up and from within, we have enemies from the outside, we have enemies coming in from the inside. He gets this prophetic word. We've talked about the prophetic word and how important that is in the book of the Kings. This is pivotal because this Ahiah guy comes along, and we're going to see him later on too, that he doesn't necessarily give good news to Jeroboam next time he encounters him later in our story. But the Lord has said this is what's going to happen, and it doesn't take much for him to do that. So we see at the end of chapter 11, you guys have been hearing about Solomon for a long time, but now it's time for the curtain to be pulled on Solomon. So we see now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, all hit, and as well as his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? That time, the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. He slept with his ancestors. He's buried in the city of his father David, and his son Rehoboam succeeded him. I know we often see, and if you read through the books of the Kings, you will often see these books mentioned. The books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah and Israel, the book of the Annals of the Kings of Judah, the book of the Acts of Solomon. We don't have these books. They no longer are extant. We may discover them in the sands of Egypt tomorrow for all I know, but we don't have a lot of these books. Sometimes people think this may be referring to the writer of Chronicles, but remember, we think the chronicler wrote much later than this, and after the books of the Kings were written. Most people think the chronicler wrote post-exilic time period, so it wouldn't make any sense if the Chronicles books didn't exist for this author to write that in. Now, these verses could have been added later when the Chronicles existed, but really it refers to a lot of different books that we don't have, even books written by, like Isaiah or somebody like that we see in 2 Kings. So when you see these, just know these are books that obviously existed in the time that the audience of 1 Kings was reading them, and that we just don't have them today. Who knows what else it might say. Now, we do have some of the books, some of the Proverbs in the book of Proverbs are attributed to Solomon. Not all of them, but many of them are attributed to them. There is an apocryphal book called The Wisdom of Solomon that nobody thinks is really written by Solomon, but it's kind of proverbial in its nature. But just when you see this, just know these are books that we just simply do not have. But 40 years he reigns over Israel. So for a long time, really an entire generation in Bible time, Solomon reigns over this. So then we move on to Rehoboam. So Solomon's time is over. The kingdom is going to be divided, and the division is about to happen, and Solomon's son doesn't help the case anymore. He hurts things, but we'll talk here in just a minute about really did Rehoboam have any choice in this matter. And so we see what is often contrasted in the Proverbs, for example, is wisdom and folly. And we've talked in here already in class about how prized wisdom was and how complicated that word is in ancient Near Eastern thought. Foolishness is the same way. Often we see wisdom embodied as a woman, lady wisdom and dame folly. Folly being compared to a female kind of character as well in there. And so what we see here is Rehoboam doesn't make very, very good decisions. Now keep in mind, sometimes when I think we tell our children these stories, we picture Rehoboam as a young, idiotic king. Well, he may have been idiotic, but he was not young. He is 41 years old when he takes the throne. And so obviously he was a child of Solomon about the time Solomon started to reign. And so he's 41. Now, I know that for many of you in this room, 41 sounds young. It is beginning to sound that way to me. I told the men's class the other day, my parents live in Goulitsville in a 55 and up community. I realized that come Sunday, I'll be 3 years away from being eligible to buy a house there. And I thought, whoa, that's not supposed to happen. And these AARP things show up in the mail every day. I am beginning to think about 41 being young myself. But in this day and time, when lifespans of people who didn't live in palaces and enjoy a very nice and sanitary life was not much past 41, Rehoboam would have been expected to have more wisdom than he had. And if he had been raised in the royal house, probably well educated, or should have at least been well educated, you think he would benefit from some of Solomon's wisdom at some point, even though obviously Solomon ran the train off the tracks religious-wise. You think he would have a little bit of wisdom about him, but he doesn't demonstrate that in our story today. So he says to the people, I'm trying to figure out how to rule. My father ruled with some sort of a hard, rough way on people when it comes to forced labor. Now, we talked last week about the Israelites were not enslaved, but they were forced labor. We talked about the differences between it. So he asked some of the older folks there that had served in Solomon's court and apparently soaked up a little bit of the wisdom, or at least talked with some sense. And he said, hey, lay off of us a little bit. Your father's yoke was very heavy. Some very big-time building projects. We need a break. And so he says, why don't you act like a servant to the people, not a taskmaster or an overlord to them, and they'll serve you back. So we look at that with some measure of wisdom. Now, we look at that as being very wise advice, but I want us to think about ruling over an ancient kingdom, how lenient you can really be. You have to be very careful to be too nice. I am a big Darth Vader fan, and what I tell you is you can't rule over an empire with an easy hand. and keep people in line. You can't be perceived as being a weak king that can be pushed around. So there is a little bit of a limitation to how much easy you can be. It can't all be just fun and games and everybody just act however they want to. So Rehoboam is hearing this advice saying, okay, what they're saying is maybe we can slow things down a little bit and not be as industrious. But Rehoboam also has to consider, doesn't he want to build? Doesn't he want to match the greatness of his father and leave his legacy behind as any ancient Near Eastern king would do? So he goes to his cronies that are his age or younger, I assume, based on the text. And they say what most kings would probably think is good advice is you be a tyrant and they will fear you. Well, there has to be a balance of this in kingdom ruling. People expect a lot of things out of their king. They expect justice and fairness and to be a benevolent king to his people, but they also expect him to rule over them and keep things in boundaries, not be easily manipulated or betrayed. And so a little bit, there's somewhere in between being a tyrant and being I'm just going to give everything away and I'm not going to make everybody do anything. It's all going to be rainbows and unicorns. Neither one of those function very well in a king's rule. So in a way, Rehoboam is kind of like, well, I could see, when I try to think like these people, I say, I can see where this advice, both pieces of advice, are worth listening to. But really, the one thing that he does is follow after the bad choice. And so when he says be a tyrant, the people are tired of that. There has to be a balance of that. And say, okay, we just can't keep on keeping on. We've been 20 years working on this palace and on this temple and other projects and moving timber and all that kind of stuff. We need a break. And so maybe giving a little bit of a break. But what Rehoboam doesn't do is he doesn't do things equal to Solomon. He says, I'm going to be worse. And so obviously the people were okay with Solomon. He decides to be worse. In chapter 12, verse 10, we have an idiom there that we do not explain in children's classes. When he says, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. In today's vernacular, we may say, I'm more of a man than my father. And that may seem a little explicit, but it's not the first sexual innuendo in the Bible. I hate to break it to you. And so we see that he's saying, I'm tougher than my father. I'm more man than my father. You think he was hard on you. I'm going to be even harder. That's the folly. The folly was that he decided to be worse. Why could he not be like Solomon? Or maybe slightly more lenient than Solomon? Or say, okay, we won't be as aggressive. We'll give you a break for a little bit of time. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't try to be balanced. And couldn't we use some balance today in our world and in our politics and everything that we encounter? Such extremities and people pushing a pendulum so far one way and it's swinging back too far the other. It's just mayhem. It doesn't work. So he was unwise in saying that I've got to really prove myself as bigger than my father. Now look, that sounds arrogant and the height of hubris to us. When you think you're going to be bigger than Solomon, that dude built the temple, man. And he was given wisdom by God. But what would you be like if you were the son of an ancient Near Eastern king and you took the throne? Would you want to be viewed as less than your father? I mean, let's just be honest. Would you want to be, well, I sure am glad my father was a great king. I'm going to be happy just to be an honorable mention as a king of Israel. No. And a matter of fact, don't you want to be even bigger than your grandfather, the great warrior king? You know, it's one of those things where you want to continue to be greater and aspire. People didn't try to build smaller and smaller pyramids. Okay, Pharaohs didn't say, you know what, I think I want to just keep building smaller and smaller. I want to have less of a tomb. I want to have not as many riches in my tomb. And so I can understand a little bit of his thinking. He says, my father whipped you with lashes. I'm going to whip you with scorpions. Now, we don't know what that means. There is a Akkadian cognate that means like a barbed whip. So something worse than just a regular lash. And speaking figuratively, I'm going to inflict more pain on you. Is all we really have to know. I don't think that he was going to let scorpions sting them. I don't think that really, because it doesn't go along with what he says when he whipped you with a lash. It's kind of like, you know, when my old man gave me the choice between a belt and a switch. I like the belt. long as it didn't use the buckle end, okay? I would prefer that because it didn't cut as bad as that switch did. And so, it's the lesser of the choices between things. He suggests, I'm going to be harder on you. And so, really, if we think about those things as we consider who gave the better advice. Now, we would say, what would we say if we think about it from a godly perspective? Who gave the better advice, the older or the younger? The older gave the more godly advice. Of course, I don't know how godly any of them were that served Solomon because they chased after these foreign gods, maybe. What about from a human perspective? Y'all are not so quick on your answer. What's that? The younger probably, as we think about what a king needed to demonstrate. Keep in mind also when father dies and a new king comes in, there may be others who would vie to take the throne. Sometimes you have to put down a heavy foot and make sure that people fear you so that they don't try to kill you and throw you off the throne. That's a real thing. Once again, we don't think about that because our leaders ride off in a nice helicopter and everything's real peaceable. That's not usually how things changed hands in the ancient world. There are very few Roman emperors that went down to their grave a ripe old man. It's not very often that happens. And so maybe there is some advice when you think about, I want to be greater than Solomon. I want to be bigger than my father. I want to build more than my father. I want to be remembered as Rehoboam the Great. That's what I want to be. So in some ways, that's the human side of him thinking through that. I don't know if Rehoboam could have been a godly man or not, but he decides to go in a direction that produces rebellion. And who is going to be the leader of that? Who has come to Solomon? Why is Rehoboam even asking this advice? Jeroboam and the people come to him and say, hey, what are you going to do? And he asks for 3 days to think about it. And this is the advice he seeks in the interim until Jeroboam comes back. This is Jeroboam, ancient labor leader. Okay, and we think about somebody who is a powerful leader of labor who makes unwise decisions on how he handles certain people's money that wound up probably making him into hamburger. That didn't happen to Jeroboam. But we think about a labor leader here. We think about somebody leading a group of people. That's what Jeroboam was. He was with the labor people, going up against the wealthy and the powerful, something that many of you in this room don't even know who that is, some of you younger people, but we go visit his grave sometime, and if you find it, you let somebody know and write yourself a book on that. And so we think about, that's what Jeroboam is. He's a labor leader, and he's a very, very powerful and influential guy, and they don't like the answer. They don't like the answer, and they divided. He disregards them. He took the advice of the young man. So the king did not listen to the people because it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahiah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So, did Rehoboam really have a choice? Well, if Rehoboam had chosen to be nice to the people, then the Lord's prophecy wouldn't have come true, Johnny. I mean, it's kind of a rock in a hard place, isn't it? To think about this, of Rehoboam not having free will. Now look, I don't know the answer to this question, and I'll tell you why. I'm not a theologian, okay? But this is something to think about because the text tells us that Rehoboam makes this decision, and this came about because the Lord said what was going to happen, and it had to happen. So I don't know if Rehoboam made the wrong choice, but he made the choice that worked out according with the will of Yahweh, that he was going to do this. Now, we could also say, perhaps, even if Rehoboam had chosen to go with the older men's advice, the Lord would have still seen fit to divide the kingdom, right? That it would have come about in some way. But this is kind of like the quandary when we say, well, we're angry at a man who would betray Jesus, right? Remember that? Somebody betrays Jesus. And Jesus says, better off that man not even be born, right? But then it says it was to fulfill a prophecy. And so somebody had to betray the Son of God. That's tough, isn't it? we don't want to think, that's way too complicated for a Wednesday night. We won't spend any time on that. There is a dividing wedge here that happens, and this is the time when the hammer strikes the wedge. When they're not going to take anymore, and Jeroboam, a man of the people, takes his people. This is a rough map. Look, don't ever draw lines too tightly on ancient maps. But in general, we see the northern kingdom of Israel. Eventually, it becomes headquarters in Samaria, the town of Samaria. Bethel is where we'll talk about Jeroboam building a sanctuary. And then you really have a line drawn just north of Jerusalem, where's the boundary between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom as we think about this divided territory. An interesting time marker that we see that doesn't give us a real good time frame, but we see in 19, so the house of Israel, they rise up against Rehoboam has to flee to Jerusalem and get out of town. They rebel against him. It says, so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Well, that doesn't tell us exactly when this was written, but it can tell us that it was written when Israel was still existing and that Judah still existed. So some portion of this text was written before the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, because they're no longer at each other's throat if there's no northern kingdom in there. So it's very interesting to think about the perspective by which this was written and goes into time. I don't know the exact time that would be, but if we think about this being in the early 900s, early 10th century, then Israel was conquered in 722, so a couple hundred years sometimes. I was thinking the other day that we often think about one author writing all of the books of the Kings, what we call 1st and 2nd Kings. I don't know if that necessarily has to be true, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the case that it was a single author. Some people call him the Deuteronomist, and I know you really are dying to know all this information, but it is also possible that the book of Kings, as we know it, as Jesus knew it, as Paul knew it, was completed over a period of time by multiple authors. I don't have any problem with that because I believe God can inspire multiple authors. He inspired multiple authors for the entire Old Testament. He inspired multiple authors for the entire New Testament. And so I don't have a problem with that. It's just interesting to think about this time in perspective. Well, Rehoboam thinks, I'm going to put this down. And I would think that way as well, that I'm going to put this rebellion down. And he puts together 180,000 chosen troops, we see in verse 21 of chapter 12. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. Again, the prophetic word standing out in the books of the Kings. Say to King Rehoboam of Judah, the son of Solomon, and all the house of Judah and Benjamin, so we see them combined there, and to the rest of the people, thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your kindred, the people of Israel. Let everyone go home, for this thing is from me. So they heeded the word of the Lord and went home again according to the word of the Lord. And so Rehoboam wisely, I've got to put this rebellion down. I can't lose part of this kingdom. Now look, Rehoboam didn't know what Jeroboam knew, right? Rehoboam did not hear Ahiah on the road with this prophecy from Yahweh. So Yahweh's prophet now, I say Shemaiah, that's the best way I can pronounce that name. He tells the message to give to Rehoboam, this dividing of the kingdom, this is my call. This is something that I am doing. Now, I wish he'd gone on and said, here's why I'm doing this. Because your father Solomon chased after Chemoth and Milcom and all these other gods. I wouldn't be surprised to see that formula come up again. But he tells them to wave off. Now, not next week, but in 2 weeks, we will begin in verse 25. Your homework is to read 1 Kings because you've already read the end of chapter 12. But if you have not read that and you're watching online, if you want to start back, we'll start in 2 weeks in verse 25, and we'll see Jeroboam begin to go the way. He's going to wind up being a very famous name in the rest of this book as really the one who was terrible about following other gods. He's talked about as when we see evil kings of Israel later on, when we encounter this book, they went in the same way of Jeroboam, chasing after these different gods and the things that they are doing to him. So we'll start right there, and we see he kicks it right off by building some golden calves. And we'll talk a little bit too about what about the temple, Jeroboam? We hung out with you and we rebelled against Rehoboam, but Rehoboam still has the temple. So are we not going to be able to go back to the temple anymore? And so Jeroboam has to figure out, how can I keep these people from going back south to the temple to worship, because then I'll lose them. Because they'll remember that everything revolves around this temple of Yahweh, and we'll have some problems. So that's it for tonight. I got 8 seconds left, and so I will miss you guys. I will. But I tell you again, like I said, look forward to Lance leading class and appreciate very much his willingness to do that.